Fruitful Living with Sissel Anderson. Here on Morning Joy, where truth matters.
Welcome back to Morning Joy, where truth matters. I'm your host, Keith Downey, and we're about to talk on the top things we should or should not do after committing a sin, particularly one of a grave matter. And to talk all about this is Sissel Anderson. Good morning, Sissel.
Good morning, Keith. What better way to start your Wednesday than I'm hearing myself twice, but to talk about sin.
So, yeah.
There we go. I think that's better.
Perfect. Go ahead.
Okay, perfect. All right. Good morning. Now that I can speak a little bit better. I was wondering, Keith, I was going to ask you, what do you think are some of the top things you should or shouldn't do as soon as you have committed a sin, especially one of grave matter?
So the one that comes directly to mind is talking yourself out of it being actually that bad. Like, it's that, God knows my heart. I didn't really mean to do it, and just try to talk my own self out of going to confession. Yeah, that's a super big one for sure. Yeah, that was that's one I definitely have on my list. And when I was asking the young adults, okay, what do you think is the number one thing, if I could give advice on the number one thing to do or not to do for after you commit a sin, especially one of grave matter. And everyone was coming up with so many different reasons, but the one that I came up with that I think is one of the most important ones is just 3 words: do not despair. Because just do not despair, because the way that the devil works is that he likes to tempt you into sin, likes to tell you, oh, this is something that you should do. It's not that big of a deal. Just do this thing. It's not a big deal. But as soon as you do the thing, he's like, wow, I can't believe you do that. Like, I can't believe you'd be so awful and do that. And wow, okay, I'm just going to leave you. He's the prince of lies. He likes to be able to twist things in such a way that makes us feel so terrible about doing it. Obviously, of course, we should have guilt and shame about committing a sin, but he gets it to the point where he thinks that we cannot receive God's mercy, which is really, really a dangerous thing. And there's some biblical characters that we can point to that did, one that despaired and one that did not despair, and those are Jesus' own disciples. We have Peter and Judas. Right. Peter and Judas, in the days of Christ's passion, both did things. Obviously, Judas, he betrayed Jesus and told people where he was, and they arrested him, and that caused his crucifixion. And Peter denied Jesus when he was in his hour of need. He denied that he knew Jesus. He was standing there saying, yeah, no, I don't know that guy, because he didn't want to get himself in trouble too. Those are 2 very, very serious things. But Judas despaired. He ran off, felt guilty, he despaired, and he killed himself. Whereas Peter was like, oh my goodness, I made this horrendous mistake. Let me cling to Jesus and ask for his mercy. 2 very different things. And one of them we call a saint, and one of them we do not. And so I think it's really important to remember to do not despair the second that you sin, because again, the devil will be in your ear and saying, either he's going to be telling you it's not that big of a deal and that you don't need to go to confession, or he's going to be saying it's such a big deal you can never get forgiveness from this. So that's my number one thing. Do not despair. Another thing, I'm going to go through all the do nots, and then we'll go through all the do's. Do not despair is number 1. Second one, do not keep sinning. Which everyone's like, okay, Sissel, thanks, man. That's really helpful advice. I remember when I first started this presentation and I was talking about we're going to talk about, original sin, mortal sin, venial sin, and how to stop yourself from sinning, and how to kind of amend that. And one girl raised her hand. She's like, I got this. I have an idea. Just don't sin. And I'm like, you know what? Presentation over. Easy. But do not sin, especially if you're dealing with something with grave matter and it's something that maybe you have a bit of a tendency to do over and over again. Once you've sinned once, like that, you have a temptation to be like, well, I'm already going to have to go to confession and get forgiveness. What's a few more times? But really, that's just taking extreme advantage of God's mercy. And we don't ever want to be doing that. So even if it's going to be a day or 2 before you can get to confession, do, whatever you can to ask God to say, please just help me to stay pure from this. Help me to stay away from sinning in these next few days and stop from like being tempted into this direction, so that you don't keep sinning and just keep piling on to that, because that would not be good. That's kind of silly, like kind of saying, oh, I've already murdered one person. What's another 3 or 4? Like sounds really bad when you say something very extreme like that, but it's the same thing when we do other sins.
Yeah, it reminds me of when I used to do the paleo diet pretty like to the T, and then there'd be cheat days, and I'd be like, well, what's one extra pizza?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like, what's another cookie? How could it hurt me? It's like, it could actually.
Yeah, it's not good.
Also, do not stop praying. We have a tendency of thinking kind of like, when we're despairing and thinking God can't forgive us, that how do I deserve to speak to God when I'm in this state? Like, how can I talk to God? And I think that's like the time when we really need to talk to God. So please keep praying, and asking him, like, listen, I know I messed up. Please be with me, and just be very honest with him about that. Because we have to do that in all of our relationships. We all mess up in all of our relationships. We do things to hurt other people, and we have to, it's awkward, it's uncomfortable, but you have to sit there and be like, hey, I messed up, but I'm going to work on this. And I need your help to, hold me accountable here. And another one, kind of going along with the, not adding a sin onto a sin, especially if it's a mortal one. A mortal one, of course, constitutes a few different things. It has to be of grave matter. You have to do it with your full knowledge, and with like you are not being held against your will to do it. Right. And so if it does fall under all those 3 things and it's a mortal sin, do not take communion on top of that, because that would be another grave matter to do. So those are the do nots. What do we think, Keith?
No, they all make sense. Absolutely. Now I'm curious now to know all of the do's. The do's.
Those are much more positive. The do's. First thing I say is that as soon as you've like recognized that you've done the sin, sometimes it's going to be very obvious, immediately, and sometimes it's going to be like a couple, hours later. You're like, ooh, I really did that thing. That was not good. Immediately ask for God's mercy and forgiveness and help avoiding sin. Obviously you need to go to confession, but before you can even do that, acknowledge it with God and say, like, I messed up and I really need your help and I'm sorry. The next thing is get your behind to confession. That is really important. Sometimes I've told myself, like, I have to get to confession within a certain amount of time, like I need to get within probably before Sunday Mass for sure, but like within the next day or 2. And that might be extremely quote unquote inconvenient for my schedule. I do have to, arrange things, sometimes get up really early or, do whatever I need to do to get to the confession. My friends always tease me because I say I'm like a walking confession time machine. If anyone asks me like, hey, Sissel, is there a confession like anytime in this area on this day? I'm like, let me just tell you, because I know all the confession times. And then, of course, do keep praying is one of them. And then the last one I say is cling to Jesus and ask for his help. Don't run away from him. Don't hide from him, but cling to him in that hour of need. St. Maximilian Kolbe, who we know has a really strong devotion to our Blessed Mother, has this great little meditation or a quote that he says about on serious sin. And I want to read a little bit of it because it talks a lot about like that do not despair. He says, whenever you feel guilty, even if it's because you have consciously committed a sin, a serious sin, something you have kept doing many, many times, never let the devil deceive you by allowing him to discourage you. Whenever you feel guilty, offer all your guilt to the Immaculate without analyzing it or examining it as something that belongs to her. My beloved, may every fall, even if it is serious and habitual sin, always become for us a small step towards a higher degree of perfection. And he goes on to talk a lot about, like, when we're permitted to fall like this, it is an opportunity to humble us and remind us of our reliance on God. And that, the devil will try to come through and depress you. But it's really just a beautiful reminder that it's an opportunity for us to grow that much more.
Yeah. Growing in humility as well, because it does take a point of humility to be like, okay, I messed up. I need to go to confession, and this is embarrassing. I just need, and so there's like that added level of humility that once you do it, you're like, well, that wasn't so bad. Like, why was I being so rough on myself? This is ridiculous.
No, for sure. Yeah. And also it's I want to point out, because I think some people in the chat mentioned about, scrupulosity. Because I'm someone who goes to confession quite frequently, but again, that's just because I, need God's mercy. But there's some people who I think do get stuck into this routine of like, oh my goodness, every little thing I've done has become a mortal sin and I must go to confession daily, and it becomes a really dangerous place. So I want to make sure I throw out there that, of course, you need to be careful of this. So it would be good to have a spiritual advisor. You can talk to the priest and ask. A priest will literally tell you that's not a mortal sin. Like if you explain the situation and you might be just overthinking it. So make sure, sometimes a priest may tell you can't come back to confession, for a few days. Like you need to breathe a second, because that's not helpful towards our faith life at all. But when you do, choose your confession time, go there, make a good confession, if you have something and maybe you haven't gone to confession in a while, make sure that you book a time with a priest so that you can take that time to really go in depth to the past, few years or however long it's been since you went to confession.
Yes, and also do an examination of conscience often, so that way you don't have to what did I do? I can't even remember what I did last week. So yes, thank you so much, Sissel, for joining us. What a great conversation. We can find you on Back to the Father Friday afternoons on YouTube, 1 p.m. Central. You're also the host of Young and Present in Dallas. So good. But that is the end of our first hour. So if you are going to be listening to the Holy Mass coming up next, always keep us in your prayers, and we'll continue to keep your prayers and our prayers and your intentions, of course. But we do have another hour coming up full of truth and joy. So make sure to stay tuned for that after this really quick break. And until then, God bless. Make it a joyful day on Morning Joy, where truth matters.
This has been Morning Joy, where truth matters, hosted by Keith Downey. Take some joy with you today. Visit grnonline.com/joy to listen again, share a segment, or answer the question of the day. That's grnonline.com/joy.